this is where we lead into part 2, justifying our truth claims. How do you justify any claim that you make about the world? So what I do here on page 9 is I get into two theories of how we justify our truth claims. And what this involves is the structure of knowledge. How do you structure your knowledge claims? And I think this is an easy question to answer. This is actually one of the easier things you have to deal with in epistemology. It's the source of knowledge that becomes a little tricky. But the structuring of knowledge is actually quite easy. But there are two options that are usually given today. One is coherentism, and the other is foundationalism. And I am a foundationalist. I am not a coherentist. But here's a definition of coherentism given by Alan White. According to the coherentist theory, to say that a statement, usually called a judgment, is true or false, is to say that it coheres or fails to cohere with a system of other statements. That it is a member of a system whose elements are related to each other by ties of logical implication, as the elements in a system of pure mathematics are related. Many proponents of the theory hold, indeed, that each member of the system implies every other member. So, how do I know that a statement is true? Because it's part of an overall system of reality, an overall system of belief, and there's an internal coherence to it such that it just shows itself to be true. That's coherentism. Well, the system is the system of your mind. So, what perspective should I have on the world? I should have the most coherent one. And when I reach that system that is most coherent, then I've reached the true system.
Isn't that going to be different for every person?
Yes, and that's the problem with coherentism. The problem with coherentism is that it doesn't help you adjudicate competing truth claims that are equally coherent. So, for example, the example I give is the debate between the Copernican system and the Ptolemaic system. Now, what are those? Well, these were the systems of cosmology that were developed in the Middle Ages and early Renaissance period and scientific revolution, of course. So Ptolemy said that the Earth is the center of the universe, and all the planets, the sun, the moon, all the stars, they revolve around it. Now, that's a perfectly coherent system of reality. There's nothing illogical or contradictory about it. There's nothing illogical or contradictory about the statement that the Earth is flat and that the sun goes around it. It's not illogical in the sense that I've committed no logical contradiction. Now, you might say, well, what's wrong with it? I would say it's not true. It's not true because it doesn't correspond to reality. But it's not illogical. I could say unicorns exist. Well, there's nothing illogical about a unicorn, a horse that flies with one horn on its head. Kind of cool. There's nothing illogical about Thor. That's why we can actually watch movies and enjoy them, because they have a kind of coherence to them. If there's incoherence in the movie, you're not going to enjoy it because it disrupts the story. This is why a lot of us don't like sequels when they get a new person to play a character, because it destroys the continuity between the sequels, between sequel and the new movie, or I'm sorry, the prequel and the sequel. There's no continuity between them, and that's why we don't like it. We only forgive certain franchises for changing actors, like the James Bond franchise. We'll forgive them because we want James Bond to go on forever. And Sean Connery can't be James Bond forever, so we'll forgive them. But we're not going to forgive Marvel if in Infinity War that's coming out next year, they fire Robert Downey Jr. and give us a new Tony Stark. That just would not be kosher. We would not like that. It would destroy the continuity. So as long as you come up with a coherent story, we enjoy the movie. But that doesn't mean that Thor exists, or that there is a group of people called the Avengers who save New York City from the Chitauri. Or that doesn't mean that in reality, in a galaxy far, far away a long time ago, a guy named Luke Skywalker reconciled his father to the Force. It's not illogical. Now, we would all say that the Star Wars universe is physically impossible because you can't live on a planet that orbits two suns. You just can't. You will burn up. Nor can you have a weapon that is a laser that just arbitrarily stops mid-space that you could use to deflect other blaster fire. And that the lightsaber defies the laws of physics. I want a lightsaber. It's the coolest weapon, in my opinion, ever. But it's not going to happen. It just isn't, because the laws of physics just keep it from happening. And the reason I'm a Copernican and not a Ptolemaic is because Ptolemy's system, coherent as it is, isn't true. By the way, here's an argument against Ptolemy, and this shows you how systems work. Mars is sometimes closer to the Earth at certain times of the year than at others. So the question became, if Mars is orbiting the Earth in a perfect circle, how is that possible? And so the Ptolemaic cosmologists in the Middle Ages said, well, not only is Mars going around the Earth, it's going around something else. And so they ended up creating this very complex system where you had all these epicycles. While all these heavenly bodies are going around the Earth, they were also going around other things. Now, what were they doing? They were saving the system. They were saving the coherence of the system. Okay?
So they created something to save the system.
Well, they hypothesized something to save the system. Now, Copernicus, when he proposed his idea, didn't really have a whole lot of evidence for it. He read ancient Greek philosophers, many of whom had said the Earth goes around the sun. But he didn't have actual physical evidence for this. But what he had was simplicity. He said, it's just so much simpler if we put the sun in the center and say the Earth goes around the sun. It's easier that way. And of course, he waited till after his death to have this thing published because he was afraid that, he might get in trouble with the church or something. Right? But so what did we do? We ended up empirically verifying what Copernicus was saying. And the people that did that would be people like Kepler, and then especially Galileo, who used the telescope and saw that this idea that the Earth is moving is far more plausible than the idea that it's stationary. So how are we doing? By the way, this is actually one of the biggest problems in debate. Sometimes you'll end up having two people with two coherent systems battling each other. And what's really lacking among the two of them is a lack of knowledge concerning certain facts. So if you just knew more facts, you might be able to break the tie. But until more facts come into play, you're not going to be able to do it. And there's some people who are so tied to their system that their system is going to trump any fact. And that's actually one of the most important things you can't do. You can't have a system that is always having to explain away the facts. Eventually, you're going to have to break. If one or two facts come your way and you can't explain them, given your system, it's not irrational for you to put them on the back burner, right? And go, well, I really don't know how to do with this, because there may be a discovery or a theory that comes along later that kind of reconciles the fact of the theory. But if you got like 1,000 things that your theory can't explain, then it might be time for you to give up your theory. All right, so I'm not a coherentist. So what am I? I'm a foundationalist. On page 9, foundationalism is very simple. A foundationalist says that a proposition is known, that is, it is justifiably true, and therefore you should believe it. It is known if either A, it is self-evident, or B, it is logically entailed by that which is self-evident.
Can you define self-evident?
Yes. Self-evident is what we need to define. And then I go on to say this, Self-evident beliefs are those which carry within themselves their own evidence and are hence undeniable. In a word, a belief that is self-evident is properly basic. It is properly basic. Some self-evident beliefs are incorrigible or undeniable, like triangles have three sides. That's just analytically true, right? While others are simply evident to the senses. I see a blue sky. While it is logically possible to do so, it is difficult to deny propositions that are evident to the senses. Generally, we assume the principle of credulity, that is, sense perception is deemed innocent until proven guilty. So I'm walking down a railroad. I'm looking down the railroad tracks. What do they look like? The railroad tracks. What happens if I look further down? Sometimes they look endless, and sometimes they look like they converge, at least to me. Or I'm driving in a car and I look out the window in front of me, and it's on a hot day, and what do I see? Maybe 100 yards in front of me. Water. Okay. When I was a kid, I used to go, Dad, let's go through that water, and then we'd get there and there was no water, and then I'd look ahead and it was still there. I was like, where's that water coming from? He's like, what water? What are you talking about? It looked to me like there was a puddle of water on the road just way up. Well, those are cases where sense perception has deceived me. Okay? I'm experiencing an illusion, something illusory. But notice that sense perception also corrects it. So when I get up to the illusion, my senses actually readjust and they tell me. So unless I have good reason to believe that my senses have deceived me, like in the case of the water or the converging tracks, I keep walking down that railroad and they don't ever converge. Unless I have good reason to think that my senses have deceived me, I'm just going to believe what I see.
But can our senses be deceived without us acknowledge that they're being deceived?
Yes, they can. They can. But what choice do I have under such conditions? Let's say that we're in the Matrix. Let's say that I'm in the Matrix. You and I are both in the Matrix. Okay? So we're not really here. We're actually part of a computer construct. You and I are actually in pods, and we have a device in our heads stimulating our minds to create the illusion that we're actually here in this room having this discussion. Well, until you give me good reasons to think that that is the case, could be the case, but until you give me good reasons to think that that is the case, I'm going to go on believing that no, you and I are really here. We are not really in pods and all of that. So, there are all kinds of beliefs that I can't prove. I can't prove that you and I have been sitting here having this discussion for more than 5 minutes. Now, you might say, wait a minute. My cell phone that this is being recorded on says 48 minutes and counting that you've been talking. Yeah, but see, God could have created the universe 5 minutes ago and given us built-in memories and false histories. Now notice that any argument you give me at that point is going to be falsified by, well, God just created that along with everything else. You can bring me to your house and show me pictures of you growing up. No, God gave you not only false memories, but put these pictures around to make you think. Now, until you have evidence that that is the case, I think it's absurd for you to go along in life and just think that you're no older than 5 minutes. I think that you should go along in life believing that, you're as old as you are, and that God did not create you 5 minutes ago, assuming there's a God in the first place to do the creating.
So, okay.
I look outside and I see a tree, and I say, there's a tree before me. Or as Roderick Chisholm says, philosopher, I am appeared to treely. Now, that proposition is self-evident to me in the sense that it is just evident to the senses. And unless I think, I have good reason to think that I should doubt my senses in this experience, I'm going to believe that there's a tree there instead of believing it's some sort of an illusion.
What about the person that takes only what their senses can gather as evidence?
That's a different issue. That's called an empiricist. and we're going to get into that. That's the difference between the source of knowledge and the structuring of knowledge. All right, on page 10, I go on to give some other self-evident beliefs. Along with the assumption that sense perception is reliable, classical foundationalists have articulated properly basic beliefs known as first principles of reasoning. Any list of such principles would include, at the very least, the following. The principle of existence, that something exists. Now, do you have a problem with that? You have to exist before you have a problem with that, so I don't think you're going to have a problem with that, right? So being is not non-being. This is the principle of non-contradiction, sometimes known as the principle of contradiction. Two contradictory propositions cannot both be true. That is, they cannot both express reality at the same time and in the same sense.
Can you give an example?
Yeah. I say that you and I are in a small southwest Georgia town, and you say, no, we're in a very large North Georgia city. Those are two contrary propositions. Now, those are technically contraries. They're not contradictions. A contrary admits of a third option. And a third option would be, no, we're in an East Georgia town. Another option would be others. But clearly, you and I cannot both be right. To be more explicitly contradictory, I say to you, I am wearing a blue shirt. And you say, you are not wearing a blue shirt. Well, that's a contradiction. There's no third option between blue and non-blue. Okay? So, we can't both be right. And it is also the case that we can't both be wrong. One of us has to be right in this case, and one of us has to be wrong. Turns out that I'm right because I'm wearing a blue shirt. Right. But that's the...
Unless your senses are failing you.
Unless my senses are failing me, exactly. So the law of contradiction is fundamental. And you knew it when you were born into this world. You came into this world. Why did you cry as a baby when you came out of your mother's womb? Because there's a difference between being warm and cold. And as you know, it's 98 degrees in the human body, and when you exited the womb, that temperature dropped from 98 degrees to about 70, and that drop is just too much for a little baby to handle. And that's why you cried. And so right there, you knew the distinction between cold and hot. And so that's just one example of how the law of non-contradiction from birth just kicked in, and you cried. So, what's beyond that? Being is being. Something is itself. That's the principle of identity. The other law is the law of excluded middle. Either A or not A. Two contradictory propositions cannot both be true, and as I said before, they also cannot both be false. So there's no third option between a contradiction. Either one half of the equation is right or the other is. And one is wrong or the other is.
That's what this is saying.
That's what excluded middle is saying, yes. Excluded middle, all of these laws, if you think about it, are entailed by one another. So if you embrace excluded middle, you're going to have to embrace both identity and non-contradiction, and vice versa. Okay, and then finally, non-being cannot produce being. This is the principle of causality. If pure non-being ever obtained, then there would be nothing right now. Because pure nothing, which, by the way, I just contradicted myself. There's no such thing as a pure nothing. There's just nothing. Nothing is the absence of anything. And therefore, if there was once ever nothing, including onces, then there wouldn't be anything right now. Because nothing doesn't even have potential. Nothing is nothing. And therefore, if there was ever nothing, there wouldn't be a something. Okay, so for every effect, there must be a cause. And usually we say, just in common parlance, in day-to-day reality, we would say every event has to have a cause. All right, if a known proposition is not self-evident, then it's logically entailed by what is self-evident. And on page 11, I give you the rules of inference. So how do you infer non-basic beliefs from basic? You look at various ways of argumentation, either or, modus ponens, and modus tollens are the most basic laws of inference. And I give you examples here. So for either or Either something exists or there is nothing. That's the major premise. It is not the case that there is nothing. In other words, I'm denying one of those disjuncts, and then therefore something exists. The major premise one, is justified by the fact that there is no third alternative to either being or non-being. Now, it is not always the case that our options can be reduced to only two. One cannot say either Buddhism or Hinduism, for many other religious options remain. Hence, even if one were to demonstrate the falsity of Hinduism, one is not thereby established the truth of Buddhism. But our argument does not commit the either-or fallacy. Since something exists and nothing exists exhausts our options, there simply is no third alternative to being or non-being. And if one grants the major premise, the minor premise rather, as I think he should, then the conclusion automatically follows. Modus ponens means the way of affirmation. And on the argument that I give you here, if there is no God, that's the antecedent, right? Then I am a monkey's uncle, okay? If there is no God, then I am a monkey's uncle. The I am a monkey's uncle is the then consequent. And so in modus ponens, we affirm the antecedent, there is no God, so that we can affirm the consequent, I am a monkey's uncle. Leaving aside all metaphorical interpretations of the consequent, what are we to think of the argument? It is without a doubt valid. So notice you can have a valid argument that entails a false conclusion. For if the first two premises are true, then the conclusion automatically follows. Notice that in modus ponens we affirm the antecedent in order to affirm the consequent, but the opposite is not a valid way to argue. So if there is no God, then I'm a monkey's uncle. I am a monkey's uncle, therefore there is no God. That is an invalid way of reasoning. It may very well be the case that I'm a monkey's uncle, and it may very well be the case that there is no God, but the non-existence of God cannot be established in this way. Modus tollens is the way of denial. So if I'm a monkey's uncle, then God exists. The next premise is God does not exist, therefore I am not a monkey's uncle. This is a valid argument. For if one can show that there is a good and necessary connection between the antecedent and consequent, then the denial of the consequent demands a denial of the antecedent. Hence, if one can establish the truth of 8, then 9 follows. As in modus ponens, the opposite is not true. That is to say, one cannot deny the antecedent in order to deny the consequent, for 7 does nothing to refute the notion that I'm a monkey's uncle in a world created by God. All right, that's a quick primer on laws of inference. Yeah. There is a classical syllogism, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. That's another one that's common. And you can actually state that in terms of modus ponens. If Socrates is a man, then Socrates is mortal. And Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. That's a modus ponens argument. So you can actually take arguments and fit them in any style you want. And usually it's the most persuasive style that you want to give to state your argument. The interesting thing is one man's modus tollens is another man's modus ponens. So if I say the following, if God exists, then humans are special. God exists, therefore humans are special. What form am I using right there?
Modus ponens.
I'm using modus ponens. So, but you have to understand, an atheist could come along and say, if God exists, then humans are special. Humans are not special. Therefore, God does not exist. You see, he's using modus tollens to come to the same conclusion using the same premises. He's just denying them. So he's denying the consequence so he can deny the antecedent. So one man's modus ponens is another man's modus tollens. Your worldview will often determine how you utilize rational inference. And that's why you need to be very careful about what you think is a purely logical proof of what you believe, because a lot of that is worldview dependent. But what can we know for sure? On page 13, I do give a sound argument demonstrating something interesting about the extramental world. And here it is. If non-being ever obtained, then it's not the case that something exists now. But it is the case that something exists now, therefore non-being has never obtained. In other words, again, If there was ever nothingness, then there wouldn't be something right now. But there is something right now. That means that for all eternity, there has to have been something. Now, what that eternal something is, who knows? But it has to be something. There has to be something that is eternal. There has to be something that has always existed. All right, now the next issue is inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning reasons from particular observations to general conclusions, right? So in inductive reasoning, we say, in science, for example, I would say, I see this object fall to the ground 100 times, and I conclude that the 101st time that I release it, it will fall to the ground. And if I see enough observations, I come to a general theory about how the world works. And if it's even more solid than that, I say it's not just a theory, it's a law.
That's deductive?
That's inductive. It's based on experimentation, observation, experimentation, and all of that. So science is grounded in induction. Historical reasoning is inductive in character. If you want to come to a general idea about how a certain society worked, you look at the particular statements, archaeological artifacts, and so forth. You look at all of that, and you come to a general conclusion about how this society worked. So it's inductive in character. Forensics is inductive. So if I want to know, if I conclude that the butler committed the murder, and in fact I give this example on page 15. Where do I start here? Well, but there might be some things I want to say before that. But I point out that experiments serve as part of the background knowledge for the conclusion. So other elements in our background knowledge when doing inductive research, we would say there's an extramental world. The world of our experience is uniform. The principle of causality is true. So to give one more example of inductive reasoning, the background knowledge we take to it, consider the question of whether the butler committed the murder. The background knowledge we take to such an induction would include the following. There's an external world. The world of our experience is uniform. The principle of causality is true. For example, knives do not simply spontaneously generate in the backs of employers. The butler was in the house between 10 p.m. and 12 a.m. Forensic evidence, like the autopsy, indicates that the victim was murdered anywhere between 10 p.m. and 12 a.m. The butler had a motive to kill the master of the house. The butler's fingerprints were found on the murder weapon. The core events given in the butler's alibi have several versions, each one seeming to contradict the other. The butler has a criminal record as well as a reputation for lying. Okay, now given that evidence, what am I going to conclude? The butler committed the murder. A second characteristic of inductive reasoning is that its conclusions are merely probable and not certain. So in a deductive argument, our conclusions are certain. If the premises are true, the conclusion automatically follows whether you like it or not. But in inductive arguments, the conclusions are probable. So I would never speak of a sound inductive argument. I only speak of strong inductive arguments. Given the evidence that I just gave you, it is a strong inductive inference that the butler committed the murder. Right? But what if our background knowledge changed? No reasonable jury would consider the following lines of defense, by the way. Martians came down and framed the butler, or it is logically possible that two different people on this planet have the exact same fingerprints, or the master of the house accidentally fell on the knife, which happened to be standing in an upright position, right? So there's certain logical possibilities that you're going to rule out as so improbable that it's not reasonable to consider them. And so we come to a moral certainty that the butler committed the murder given this background knowledge.
But we come to that by,
yeah.
So we can come to a certainty by conclusions that are probable.
It's a moral certainty based on probabilistic kinds of reasoning. Given this evidence, I am morally certain that the butler committed the murder. I am not mathematically certain, though. I wouldn't say,
Can that change, though, if evidence is later presented and then your moral certainty changes?
Yeah, my certainty changes. So notice I say this: our conclusion is highly probable, for it is inductively strong with respect to the background knowledge, but if more background knowledge came into our purview, we might change our conclusion. So the prosecuting attorneys give me all that background knowledge that I just gave you. And you're like, okay, he did it. But then the defense comes up and they say something like the following: 6 months ago, the butler converted to Buddhism and is now gaining a reputation for truth-telling. The butler has a mistress who is also in the house between 10 and 12. It is now known that the butler's mistress hates both the master and the butler. Latex gloves were found buried in the yard. They fit the mistress, but not the butler. The core events recorded in the butler's testimony can be plausibly harmonized. The mistress demonstrates an unusual nervousness while being questioned, while the butler has always been both sad over the death of the master and yet calm in the face of questioning. Now what would you conclude? You might not say that the mistress did it, but you're going to doubt that the butler did it, right? So you're going to question that inductive inference.
So if that's true, then how can we say that it's a moral certainty? If it can change, then how can it be certain? If it has the possibility of changing
Because
down the road,
because certainty as a proposition is a characteristic or property of persons, not evidence. You are led to certainty given certain kinds of evidence. But that doesn't mean that the evidence is certain. Okay? But it's not irrational for you to come to these moral certainties as long as you're open-minded about new evidence coming in. That's part of the problem with most people. Once they are given one side of an equation, they become very rigid in their desire to look at the other part of the equation. And that's why we have problems, right? By the way, it also is interesting when it comes to campaigns. I mean, last year, before the candidates were chosen, and it was still up in the air as to who was going to get the nomination, I heard people cussing Donald Trump, couldn't stand him, all of that stuff. Same thing about Hillary. Liberals that I knew hated Hillary, wanted Bernie to get it. But then once you came to the conclusion that Donald Trump was the only guy worthy of a vote in the election, it didn't matter what he did after the nomination. It cut no ice. And the same thing for Hillary. Those who got on the Hillary bandwagon early on and said, no matter what she did, no matter how many emails we uncovered and all that, these people were still defended, you see. So sometimes some people believe that if you say yes to this, then you almost, it's like you have a moral obligation to stick to it. And I will grant that, you don't want to be fickle in your convictions. So you don't want to say yes, no, and go through life like that. But at the same time, you always have to be willing to let go of your most cherished beliefs if new evidence arises that refutes it. You always have to be open to do that. So what you want to do is you want to find a philosophy that is fluid enough to accommodate new evidence, but solid enough to be something you can cling to. Here's a summary. We noted that this is on page 17. We noted that the best way to structure our knowledge is foundationalism. That is, we must move from principles that are self-evident to propositions that are not self-evident. First principles give us a way to structure our knowledge, while sense perception gives us the stuff we have to think about. The senses give us access to the outside world. We move from self-evident knowledge to non-self-evident knowledge by using both deductive and inductive reasoning. In fact, many philosophers seem to agree that in our day-to-day lives, we all combine deductive and inductive reasoning into what we might call an abductive way of approaching the world. For example, at a baseball game, the pitcher has studied the players on the other team and knows which ones can and cannot handle a curveball. Thus, he inductively infers that player A, who usually misses curveballs, will probably miss the one he's about to throw to him. And he deductively concludes that if he can make his opponent swing 3 times and miss, he has struck out his opponent. Notice in all of this that the pitcher is reasoning abductively, for his inductions and deductions are blended together in such a way that it is sometimes hard to tell when one ends and the other begins. Now that leads us to the issue of the source of knowledge. Where does knowledge come from? There are 3 options that you have mysticism, empiricism, and rationalism.